professor at Mass, who will cover and provide some of the insights from the latest intersessional work of the Global Plastics Treaty that took place in Thailand like a week and a half ago. From there on, we'll hear from a wider group of our independent science panel on the review of global standards and criteria to determine the safety and sustainability of plastic and non-plastic alternatives. We'll then have a Q&A session. So please stay tuned. This is a very interactive session, so we definitely want to hear from all of you here on a call, and you'll have an opportunity to speak, address some questions that you may have and considerations to bring forward during the Q&A session. The way to engage in the Q&A is by dropping your questions in a chat here with us, and then as we enter the Q&A session, I'll be pulling the questions forward, and we'll be addressing the group of the speakers. After the Q&A session, we'll go into a multi-stakeholder perspective. We have 4 presentations scheduled for today from our esteemed speakers as well as advisors to this program. And that will also be followed by a Q&A session. So if you do have questions specific to the speakers today, you'll be able to address them after the session. So feel free to drop the questions as they come during those sessions, and they will be addressed in those Q&A components. And then we'll move to closing remarks. Let's move to the next. All right. And next slide, please. Okay, so for those that are joining this call and this program for the first time, just a quick background on what we're here to do. For some of you, you're already very familiar with that, but we always want to make sure that everybody on the call is aware and familiar with the program. So the initiative and goal of this program is to develop a science-backed set of criteria. And currently we're looking at 3 core pillars: health and safety, environment, and sociocultural criteria to help us enable effective screening of plastic and non-plastic alternatives. In terms of the impact of the program, so the way we're looking at this right now is we're really hoping to develop those criteria to be used during INC-5 and help member states and INC negotiators to have more rounded understanding of this very complex issue, and bringing forward some universal criteria that can be used during the negotiation process. And this is a very much of a multi-stakeholder based engagement. So there will be a great amount of opportunity to engage and contribute to this as we go along. And the deadline that is set currently for the final deliverable of this program is October 30th. So the deliverable would be a white paper document that lists the set of criteria and provides a greater understanding of the specific considerations that we took as a group forward to bring this together. And next slide, please. So first, we want to say big thank you to our independent scientist panel that has been contributing and helping us in building and developing these criteria over time. We're still in the process of development. You'll hear from some of them today on the thoughts and considerations they're currently taking on as they're reviewing this work and contributing to it. Next slide, please. And we also going to hear from some of the program advisors that include the WWF team, they include Technology Greenhouse, Plastic Free, as well as UNEP and BPI, who have been contributing along the way to this program in different capacity, and hopefully will be continuing further as we move along in this process. So for some of you, you might be familiar with this program from the origin, and originally we kick off this initiative with a meeting in Charlotte, North Carolina at the Atlantic Packaging Solutions Center, where a group of multi-stakeholders came together to actually set and lay some of the foundation for considerations that we took into development of this initiative. So thank you all. And as you can see on the picture, there's quite a few of them, and hopefully you're still with us here today on this call. Next slide, please. And quickly on the guiding principles from us, Opulent. So Opulent here is strictly participating and working as a neutral secretariat to this initiative. So we're not taking any positions, but hoping to collect, aggregate, and develop these criteria based on the inputs of of the independent scientists panel, as well as advisors and other stakeholders along the way during the consultation process, about what you're going to learn about shortly, but quick principles and what we're really looking at right now. We're looking at developing simple and consolidated approach to criteria development. We're not looking to develop any lists or endorsements throughout this process. One of the key principles of this process in development has been to follow the top of the waste hierarchy, and that has been kind of leading our way through how we're thinking about this. And we are prioritizing human health and safety as one of the key considerations that we're taking under as this is being developed, and naturally just transition with a really deeper understanding what that means, and we'll get into that more in the detail as we discuss here with our independent scientist panel as well. And from that on, I would like to hand over the presentation to my colleague Rachel Ryan, who's our technical program lead at OPLN, and will give you a deeper understanding of where we are in terms of the program and also consultation schedule that's coming up. Rachel.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Marta, so much for the scene setting and the warm introduction. My name is Rachel Ryan. I am the newly joined technical programs lead, though I've been wading in the waters over the past few weeks. This will certainly not be the last time that you see my face or my name in your inboxes. I'm going to speak very briefly on the overview of the progress, timelines, and some logistics before handing it over to our speakers, who I know everyone is eager to hear from. All right, so first, I want to give a quick overview of our phase one kind of work output. So as Marta mentioned, but I need to echo, we need to start with a thank you to our scientists and our advisors. This has been extremely intensive, and our experts have been doing this early mornings, late nights, often around their day jobs. So we just want to recognize those inputs. As Marta mentioned, we're working towards the goal of a white paper to be published on October 30th, which we're considering as phase one. So this is the work up to that October 30th is our phase one. As we've worked through the guiding principles for the harmonized criteria, and as we've seen responses to emerging proposals like the EU and member states and the Norway, Cook Islands, and Rwanda frameworks for chemicals of concern and problematic and avoidable products, we've identified what would be feasible and most impactful for negotiators at the next INC. As you'll hear more from our speakers, we've honed phase one work as harmonizing criteria for considering whether a plastic or a non-plastic alternative is safe and sustainable per these three pillars that you see on our screen, as Marta mentioned, health and safety, environment, and sociocultural. These criteria are considering existing methodologies, regulations, and standards. And again, as Marta mentioned, we'll present a unified framework of considerations that must be taken into account when screening for plastics and non-plastic alternatives. So I'm sure this has piqued everyone's interest, and you'll hear more from the speakers in this plenary to dig into some examples of this criteria that we're working on collating across the health and across all three of these pillars, with some focus on the environmental pillar as we had our previous plenary on the health and safety pillar. So just some quick words on the progress. So as we've been working throughout this phase one process, we've been working on definitions. If you've joined previously, you'll remember that we acknowledged a need to define several key terms like essentiality, transparency, responsibility, and accountability, specifically in the context of this work. So to date, we've been working through these definitions, and of course, continually incorporating feedback and as we uncover additional needs for definitions, we're working through those to make sure that we're not perpetuating gray areas. We're also working through the guiding principles for the criteria. We're receiving another round of comments on guiding principles for the harmonized criteria, which is framing this work to push systems continually up the waste hierarchy. And where we are with the draft criteria, this is clearly a very hefty undertaking to make a universal set of criteria. And this is all in draft form. We're consistently incorporating feedback with a lot of considerations being integrated on an ongoing basis. So we're drafting the criteria for each of the pillars. You'll hear from our speakers more examples with a focus on the environment. And then I want to talk briefly about beyond Busan, so what we'll call as phase 2. What comes after Busan? So as we recognize, it's unlikely that the indicators themselves will be negotiated at INC-5. Phase 2 will be further adapting the white paper and honing the indicator bounds within each of the pillars criteria as we've defined in this phase 1 exercise. So, for example, and this is purely an example, acidification potential per the EU Air Quality Directive, US Clean Air Act might be a criteria for consideration per the environmental pillar in phase 1, but we intend to dive into testing parameters and indicator bounds in phase 2. So now for some of the administrative side, to set everything in context, here's a timeline of how we've progressed thus far and how we'll progress in the future. I won't read it all for sake of time, but just as an overview, in July, we formed this working group and had the initial ideation sessions on the guiding principles and collaborations with our scientists and advisors. In August, we conducted another round of review of the guiding principles and developed and reviewed the health and safety criteria, which many of you have heard in the mid-August plenary session. As I mentioned, we're also developing and working through the environmental criteria and considering sociocultural criteria. And in September, of course, you're hearing from us in this plenary. We're consolidating additional rounds of feedback from the scientists and advisors, and we will be pushing forward multi-stakeholder review of the draft of the white paper, which is highlighted in yellow text to really draw your attention, because I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. In October, we'll be bringing the deliverable to the member states and with the goal of finalizing by the end of October ahead of Busan, after hearing from additional round of public consultations through a third plenary session. To jump into some of the specifics, I'll conclude with logistics on the multi-stakeholder consultation process. So from now until the 19th, OPLN scientists and advisors will be reviewing the document that is being prepared for release. On the 20th, OPLN will release the document for targeted multi-stakeholder review by the end of the day. And OPLN will be scheduling live listening sessions and also set guidance for written feedback. We encourage feedback through whatever best suits the stakeholders way that they want to provide us input. From the 21st to the 30th, the multi-stakeholder consultations will be held and we'll have in-person meetings during the Climate Week in New York. From the 1st to the 8th, we'll be meeting and incorporating feedback to get that draft to the next stage. From the 9th to the 18th will be member state presentations and public consultations and third-party and a third plenary session, as I mentioned, with the final round of finalization occurring between the 19th and the 30th and publication on the 30th. So there'll be more details once we reach October on how to get involved in the public consultations and the third plenary session. So that will be coming. With that, I'll hand it back to Marta to introduce our next speaker, Tricia. And Marta.
Yes, thank you so much, Rachel, for now we're going to hear from our speaker today, Tricia Furley, a professor at Massey University, who will be giving us some insight into what happened at the in-person meeting during the conference in Bangkok, Thailand, that took place from the 24th to 28th of August. Tricia, are you with us?
I'm with you. Thanks, Marta. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, I'll kick off then. So for those of you who unaware, we at the fourth session of the INC from the 23rd to the 30th of April, earlier this year at the Shaw Centre in Ottawa, Canada, the committee agreed on intersessional work, and this would be carried out up to INC-5. We would have 2 ad hoc intersessional, it's a very long phrase, ad hoc intersessional open-ended expert groups, and these were established. They started up to inform and advance the work of the committee, and essentially to guide the work of the negotiators towards INC-5. We're very happy to receive the news that we had this intersessional work, because this was not something that that was agreed at INC3, so that was exciting to hear. The scientists wanted to contribute our work in that space, and this gives us a formal opportunity to do so. It was made very clear that this work, this intersessional work, is of a technical nature. It's for experts, it's for information sharing. It's not a negotiating, these are not negotiating meetings. The co-chairs, I feel, did a very, very good job of continuously bringing back the conversations that kept sort of moving towards more of a negotiating nature than expert knowledge sharing, information exchange. It was quite a difficult job, I think, for the co-chairs, but because it did keep moving in that direction, but they did a great job of pulling things back. So anyway, so we had some three online intersessional meetings per each expert group before the in-person group in Bangkok, Thailand, from the 24th to the 28th of August. And we also had 12 technical resource people per expert group that were nominated by the Secretariat, and that nomination was in consultation with the chair and with the secretary and the co-chairs, as well as the INC chair. So we had the technical resource persons assisting and with each of those expert groups as well. So what were those expert groups? Expert group 1 developed an analysis of potential sources and means that could be mobilized for implementation of the objectives of the treaty. And this included the establishment, or the discussions, at least information sharing, about options for the establishment of a financial mechanism. It was largely around finance, financial flows, catalyzing finance. And again, this is all for the consideration of the committee at INC-5. Expert group 2, on the other hand, was more of a technical nature, and this is where the independent experts and scientists really found their place, more so than the financial kind of discussions, although there were a number of particularly social scientists and economists and so on who were heavily involved in that, if not in person, then online. Expert 2 identified and analysed criteria and non-criteria based approaches regarding plastic products, chemicals of concern in plastic products, and product design. And that group focused on recycling and reusability of plastic products. So in some senses, if we're looking at a full life cycle approach to plastics, it was a little bit limiting, considering that particular focus. Ahead of the in-person intersessional meeting, the INC Secretariat circulated a questionnaire. They certainly did that for expert group 2. I'm not sure they did that for expert group 1, or not in the early phase, at least anyway. So there's a little bit of opportunity for feedback on a document beforehand. I would say in terms of reflections, it was very difficult to get independent experts involved in this process. And the reason for that is because member states nominated experts. And if you weren't nominated to a member state delegation, you are unable to participate in those knowledge exchanges, both online and in person. Made it very, very difficult for many independent experts to participate, because many of the member states were a little bit reluctant to take on experts outside their own ministerial, beyond their ministries. So in fact, if we looked around the room, both online and in person, we saw that there were very few independent experts outside ministries involved in this process. So a little bit of feedback very quickly before we move to the next part of the agenda on each of the expert groups. Now, I was only involved in expert group 1, so I didn't have sort of, first person experience of what was going on in expert group 1, but I can report back from others who attended that there was a focus on downstream waste handling still. And again, as you can hear from expert group 2, there was a focus even there on recycling, so that wasn't much of a surprise. Didn't address production and consumption in the way that perhaps it could have. Financial mechanism that was discussed often didn't explicitly ensure that there was support for waste handlers, waste pickers, informal sector. And the financial mechanism that was discussed, there is a risk that that will facilitate continued increase in plastic production and consumption, and that the waste volumes would be maintained at a high level. And there were questions about whether or not that would still increase regardless of the discussions on the financial support, based on the fact that the conversation remained around mid and downstream. So expert group 2, there were still questions around plastic production. There was real concerns from, I guess, from the like-minded countries, particularly around introducing the term, plastic production reduction or polymer reduction targets into any conversation. And certainly environmental health, human health, and socioeconomic impacts right through the full life cycle from extraction, including plastic alternatives and substitutes and their feedstocks, really wasn't a huge focus. And certainly, alternatives and substitutes, there's a lot of confusion, I think, from non-experts who were involved in that process around the impacts on environment and human health. We were pleased to see, at least, and this was a bit of a saving grace, I think, for many independent scientists who are looking for an ambitious and comprehensive treaty, that chemicals of concern were part of the conversation, but only insofar as they were involved in products. And so the degree to which chemicals of concern will remain within the scope of the treaty is still largely in question. And certainly if we're talking about sociocultural sustainability here and criteria, Indigenous knowledge, waste pickers and frontline communities, I did a bit of a quick count, and this was only mentioned about 5 times by 5 experts over the 5 days of the Bangkok meeting. Very, very quickly, I know that we need to move on, but very, very quickly, some of the other questions that still remain around the scope is really, the importance of independent science and the operationalization of a science body for the treaty. Transparency is still a major concern to what extent that will be introduced, considering it is crucial for any criteria. Again, reduction, things like, I guess, mechanical and chemical recycling and what that means, and to what extent that will be included, and are there considerations for human and environmental health impacts of those processes, considering that was quite a focus as a concern. To what extent micro nanoplastics and their impacts will be included in here. And again, just the same as for all the way through, really, the extent to which upstream solutions are going to be a focus of the treaty. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give you feedback on that. I'll pass back to you again, Marta and Rachel.
Thank you so much, Tricia. Now we'll be moving to more of an in-depth discussion about the independent scientific review. And we'll be looking at, again, Tricia, Richard, and Marina Fernandez. And we can move to the next slide just to introduce the speakers first. Oh, okay. Maybe let's go back then. And Tricia, we're moving kind of straight back to you here on the independent scientific review of the language definitions and guiding principles. So maybe you can just kick it off, and then we can just get on with it. That makes sense.
Yeah, Sure. So, I mean, I guess just very briefly, you know, we between the last plenary and this one here, the independent science group panel were provided with some you know, spreadsheets and in a document. One of the documents was introductory language definitions and guiding principles, which no doubt was discussed by the multi-stakeholder groups and working groups. And so we had the opportunity to review those, and also a few spreadsheets, largely on indicators for health and safety, environment, and sociocultural indicators, and largely endpoints. So we look forward to giving our feedback in the following slides on those documents that we have reviewed. Okay, great. So for this one here, I'm going to be concentrating purely on the document we received on introductory language, definitions, and guiding principles that the group had worked on. So in terms of the feedback on that, I think probably the first point that we wish to make is that we recommend, rather than endpoints and indicators, which is quite granular, to really focus on those safety criteria at a higher level. So what we're recommending here is a set of hazard-based safety criteria, and that the safety criteria be complemented by a set of sustainability criteria. We're recommending too that sustainability criteria takes a very balanced assessment or approach to the three pillars of sustainability. So that's environmental criteria, economic criteria or sustainability, and sociocultural sustainability, again in quite a balanced manner. And so what the sustainability criteria it would be slightly different from safety in the sense that the sustainability criteria for products, because that's what this project is focusing on, that sustainability criteria would focus on sustainable design of products right across the full life cycle, whereas safety criteria would take more of a hazard-based approach to environment and human health in terms of their safety, not only for chemical safety, but also nanomicroplastics and entanglement and those sorts of safety concerns. So these criteria could apply to entire products. So we're looking at entire finished whole products rather than substances, because we've seen substances mentioned, and there's a little bit of confusion between substances and the whole product. So entire products, groupings of plastic products, as we would expect to see, for example, in the annex of future instrument, products made from plastic alternatives and non-plastic substitutes. And we're suggesting to take a material agnostic approach to this, and to also include systems and services and technologies supporting the production of whole products throughout their full life cycle, and considering those also, but perhaps not the focus, considering the time that we have for the first phase of this of the sprint. So as we hear from the scientists, we encourage starting with current and relevant international standards rather than the indicators for those standards, which is a lot more granular, and treating those standards as a starting point on which to develop a fit-for-purpose set of criteria. And in our view, the relevant international standards, i.e. those standards that are relevant to whole products that we're talking about here, represent a relatively low bar, as most international standards don't adequately address the full life cycle of products, of plastics, and they don't necessarily prioritise prevention either. Many of them exclude extraction phase, for example, which is extremely important, I think, for plastics alternatives and substitutes, as well as conventional plastics. So we recommend the sprint starts from the agreed principles in the document that we have before us, that we were given to look at, and uses these as a yardstick upon which to assess the listed standards and build perhaps on those slightly based on some of the recommendations that we've provided. The criteria presented by OPLN could offer a scientific body of independent experts following the sprint, the basis that they need upon which that they may establish sets of indicators later on down the track to assess products for their safety and sustainability, again, across a range of conditions across countries and circumstances also. So there will need to be built in a significant amount of or some amount of flexibility at least. Same obligations, but flexibility later on down the track. The essential use concept I want to talk about here, because I know that there was some confusion a little bit about that. It is a complex concept. The essential use concept is planned to be embedded into EU legislation. It's precedent in the Montreal Protocol. It's been taken up with a level of interest by some member states and the experts throughout the INCs, and including in Bangkok, interestingly. The essential use concept represents a fundamental shift in regulatory thinking from risk to hazard, for example, and from safety, but including safety, but really with more of a focus on essentiality. And this will have a significant impact on the availability of many of the substances and products currently used. So for a product use to be considered essential, as many of us have talked about already in this group, the use is necessary for health or safety, or is critical for the functioning of society, and the acceptable, technical, or economically feasible alternatives are currently available. So recognising plastics can't be fully, perpetually, safely, nor sustainably recycled or otherwise circularised. The application of the essential use concept to regulate plastics and prevent plastic pollution makes sense in the context of the Global Plastics Treaty. It may be the case that we'll see an initial list of groupings of, again, the most hazardous and unsustainable plastics in the future annex of the treaty, and these may start with groupings of plastic products that have been widely phased out in the national legislation of member states. And again, these should be flexible so they can be adapted over time. So given the necessary provisions in the future instrument, the essential use concept could be crucial where groupings of hazardous and unsustainable plastic products are listed in the annex of the treaty, and yet a party may claim that a product or set of products meet the essential use criteria given their national circumstances. Now, in such a case, a party may apply for an exemption and support. They may also apply for support via the relevant subsidiary bodies of future instrument, and I'm referring back here to the work of EG Group 1, for example, to support that country that has applied for exemption, to support a just transition, since that's one of our principles, away from those hazardous products, those unsustainable products. So support could include capacity building, financial assistance, and technical support to source viable, safe, and sustainable alternatives and substitutes, and to meet time-bound phase-out targets as the conditions of that exemption. So OPLN will need a robust definition of essential use if we're going to be working with the essential use concept, to ensure the accountability and responsibility, again, going back to those principles that we're looking for, and to avoid regrettable alternatives and substitutes. So what I mean by this is that, for example, the term acceptable or technically and economically feasible that's often used in association with the essential use concept will need to be really clearly defined and the conditions established to avoid regulatory loopholes. Similarly, a set of conditions for the phrase critical for the functioning of society will also be needed, as this is a phrase that's wide open for interpretation and one that demands socially relativistic considerations also. Finally, we recommend precision of language and definitions for other terms relevant to the sprint where the term alternatives are used. Plastic alternatives and non-plastic substitutes are implied, but that's not always made explicit. And the term alternatives could, and again, we suggest, as previously mentioned, that we'd like to see a material agnostic approach, because this will avoid simply replacing a single-use plastic product with a single-use alternative or substitute, where a delivery system situated higher up the waste hierarchy at prevention, reduction, and so on, may be viable and a safer and more sustainable option. We also recommend the assessment, again, of those entire products throughout rather than substance, and circularity and the conditions for circularity will need defining. We're recommending the Ellen MacArthur Foundation conditions, which are that circular products and systems should be regenerative and restorative. Full life cycle will need clear definition, as I've mentioned before. Would it start from extraction all the way to removal and remediation? Just transition is another term that's open to misinterpretation. And transparency is something that we feel is extremely important, as it's a prerequisite for the establishment of safety and sustainability criteria. Because information about what chemicals and polymers are in products, their full products, including additives, non-intentionally added substances, and so on, their provenance and performance, including durability and biodegradability, recycle content, how to safely handle that product, how to use it and manage it at end of life, all of that will be crucial to the successful implementation of the criteria and the future instrument. Thanks, Marta.
Thank you so much, Tricia. Now we're going to move to our next speaker, Marina Fernandez, who's going to give us a little bit more insight into the health and safety criteria that we're currently considering during this process. Marina, are you with us?
Yes, here I am. Yeah, I was I had turned off my camera before because I'm having some connection issues, but I think I'm here now. So Tricia already covered a lot of the things that I was going to say here. We support a hazard-based approach for products, materials, and others, and we believe that the all products should be tested for hazard for human health and also for the environment. And we also think that a lot of times the tests that are currently used should be evaluated to check for need of new test methods, to check for safety for both human health and also for the environment. We also believe that even if a product is deemed safe after it's put in the market, vigilance should be monitoring for safety. If new methods arise, should be vigilance should be used the same way as for instance, pharmaceuticals. And also, if we are going to make any change, we know that currently humans and also the environment are exposed to many chemicals, for instance, from plastics. So biomonitoring of exposure to assess effectiveness of any change that is made should be important in the implementation phase of any changes made, and also important for the treaty. So I think Tricia already covered a lot of the things I was going to say about the essential use and so on. So this is my take home, very short take home. So if there is any question, I'm happy to answer.
Amazing. Thank you, Marina. And with that, we're going to move to our next speaker. We'll be covering environmental criteria today. Richard Thompson, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. So as emphasized earlier, I think it's really important that we consider the three pillars of sustainability: social, economic, and environmental. And we recommend that for the purpose of the sprint, the consideration of these pillars is balanced and enables a rigorous assessment of products and their overall sustainability across the full life cycle of that product. We also think that it's really important that the sprint focuses on building global criteria, at least initially, and then establishing the strengths and weaknesses and gaps in pre-existing global standards, rather than working at a granular level. So, for example, that the criteria could be considered, and I emphasize here that not all of these are relevant to everything. If we take a material agnostic approach, then we need to consider water use and land use. For example, if an alternative material might be made of paper, then the land use becomes relevant. If it's a renewable feedstock, then the water use maybe becomes more relevant than, let's say, perhaps with a traditional plastic product. We also need to consider the impacts on natural resources, or from the perspective of natural resource conservation. Now, this could be a consequence of the product depleting biotic or abiotic resources. For example, depletion of minerals or fossil carbon resources, or depletion of natural resources. Could also be an effect, an indirect effect on those natural resources through ecotoxicity, perhaps associated with pollution. And we should also consider effects perhaps on the functioning of those natural systems. It's also important that we consider the generation of waste from products, and that's really critical right along the life cycle. If we think, just for example, towards the end of the life cycle, waste separation, sorting are going to really be key. Labeling a product as recyclable or biodegradable or compostable is fairly meaningless if there isn't actually a waste stream in a particular location that can handle compostable waste or that is available for recycling. So we need to consider the waste stream. We also need to consider the potential unintended consequences if products get into the wrong waste stream. If a product that's designed, let's say, for commercial composting ends up in a recycling waste stream. So we need to consider the unintended consequences here. And, just to emphasize, even if I think about the UK, I think we're only on about 1/3 of the households that are actually connected to a compostable waste stream. So you could have a fantastic product that would compost, but if it can't get to the right waste stream, then it's going to end up somewhere else. So how will it perform in landfill? What happens if it ends up in a recycling waste stream? Similarly, you could have a product that degrades really well in a home composting system, but how does that work for the population that live in high-rise flats that don't have a composting, their own home composter? So we need to consider the sorting, the availability, the options, and what you do if the designed option is not available. What are the unintended consequences? So we need to consider right away along the waste generated along the life cycle. We also need to consider the pollution along the life cycle, and that's pollution of the air, it's pollution of the water. It should include by chemicals, by greenhouse gases, and by particulates such as microplastics, including any microplastics that might be generated by incomplete degradation. I think along with those initial criteria, we should consider how we set those in to the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So as previously mentioned with regard to indicators, we recommend that we start at a high level by building these criteria, looking at the strengths, weaknesses, and gaps of existing global standards in relation to those criteria, rather than starting at a global level.
Thank you so much.
And there's also going to be important my last point, also going to be need to monitoring and financing systems to support this. Thank you.
Okay, amazing, Richard. And thank you so much to Tracy and Marina as well for all your considerations so far put forth. We are currently asking all of you for adding any questions that you may have into the chat. And I would like to call in Laurent Milay-Canal with UNEP, who had some questions here to Tricia. Laurent, are you with us? Can we see you and say hi to everyone?
Hi to everyone. Thanks, Martina. Thanks, Marta. And yes, sorry, actually, I was just seeing that Tricia has already kind of replied, but that was about the concept of in practice and at scale, which I think was also super critical for what Richard was saying just now on the recyclability. So yes, if you design something as recyclable or compostable, but you don't have the infrastructure, then it doesn't work. So yeah, I think that's more or less covered. I actually had another question for Richard. So if that's okay,
Yeah,
I can put it here. And I just put it there in the Q&A, but essentially just asking about these environmental criteria that Richard was describing, because I think actually a lot of the criteria are what in life cycle assessment we call inventory indicators, which are useful as a start. But of course, water use, it also depends on where you're using water and how you're measuring water Is it consumption or is it use? Is it a dissipative use? So there's depending on the scarcity of the water where you're using it, the impacts may be completely different. So considering that life cycle assessment already has a lot of these indicators, and I'm not saying that it has everything, but shouldn't we use directly the indicators from a life cycle assessment, because those relate to the product rather than and relate as well to the impacts that you can expect. And of course, complement them with everything else that is not currently covered in LCA. So certainly in terms of safety, we would need to consider that completely separately. But these are, just some kind of comment/question. Thanks.
I mean, to respond briefly, of course, it's context dependent on the water availability in that particular instant. You're absolutely right. It's interesting that when life cycle assessment was discussed to some extent in Bangkok, there was very much a focus on assessments grounded in greenhouse gases. And I think it's important that we take this holistic approach and consider this range of different criteria that we're wanting to ensure that, as we move away from plastic products that we all recognize as being harmful, that we move to something better, not just different. And so it is going to involve this kind of fairly broad scale assessment across a range of different criteria, as exactly as you've said, Lorraine.
Yeah, and sorry, just to complement, because and that's something we hear a lot, but just to be super clear, life cycle assessment, it says it needs to consider the full life cycle, and it needs to consider all environmental impacts which are relevant for that product.
Yes.
So an LCA that only considers greenhouse gases is not an LCA. So and an LCA that only looks at specific life cycle stages, not the full life cycle from raw material extraction to end of life, is not an LCA. So I mean, we all agree here, hopefully, but that's something that we hear a lot, and we just need to provide this answer that if something is only looking at greenhouse gases, that's a carbon footprint. It's not an LCA. So
I agree
anyway,
totally. I agree completely. It's just the language is sometimes used, not not as you've just described. So
yeah, totally. Yeah, thanks.
All right. If there are any other questions on that front, please let us know. If not, we're going to move to the sociocultural criteria, and Tricia has some more insights here to share with us as well.
Yes, I'm sorry, it's me again. We would have loved to have Rufino, and unfortunately, Rufino Varela is unavailable, so I'm his stand-in. Rufino's an Indigenous scientist based in Fiji. He would have he's very knowledgeable about this. But as an anthropologist, I hope that I will do. So I guess so. Again, as noted, we've talked about this a number of times, and Richard's also reiterated this too, that we're wanting to see a balance between the three pillars of sustainability, and that, as I say, that those are balanced because they will enable a rigorous assessment of the products for their overall sustainability across their full life cycle. This balanced approach to sustainability will also ensure that socio-cultural sustainability rights and well-being are considered alongside environmental and livelihoods criteria, and are not subordinate to economic imperatives alone. As also mentioned previously, with regard to indicators, we recommend the sprint focuses at a high level by building a global criteria from the strengths, weaknesses, and gaps identified in pre-existing global standards, rather than working at that granular indicator level within those standards. However, there may be some exceptions, and this may be around nomenclature, really. So, for example, we noted that the SDGs weren't listed in the standards or indicators we were provided with to review, and yet they include pretty high level social, economic, and environmental indicators that the sprint could perhaps work with. We also noted the absence of a few other SDG related decision-making frameworks that could guide the development of the criteria for the sprint, including social value international standards. Something that is missing too from the list we were given was more of the human rights we feel are relevant to the work of the sprint. So we recommend that human rights should guide all the criteria and highlight the following relevant to this work. The UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, the right of access to information, and this speaks particularly to the transparency matter that we raised earlier, and the right to access to and participate in science. We're pleased to see the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, in the list provided to us. And we also recommend reference to the Convention on Biological Diversity's Article 8J, which is traditional knowledge, innovations and practices, as well as the World Intellectual Property Organization's Treaty on Intellectual Property, Genetic Resources and Associated Traditional Knowledge. The details of how any high-level sociocultural criteria is to be implemented in practice will require the full and meaningful participation and contributions from key representatives across the supply chain and stakeholders, including waste pickers. This will also require contributions from stakeholders, including frontline and fence-line communities and rights holders, including Indigenous peoples. The institutional and governance mechanisms for such participation and inclusion will need to be built into the provisions of the treaty, so it's really beyond the scope of the sprint. But these will eventually be needed, and I think we need to develop the criteria with this in mind. They should be built into the provisions of the treaty to ensure the criteria and indicators are socio-culturally sustainable and flexible enough to ensure just transition away from non-essential single-use products, alternatives, substitutes included. We recommend OPLN refer to other multilateral environmental agreements that promote public participation in decision-making. And examples of those are the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Agreement, and other relevant participatory decision-making processes to ensure the criteria supports just transition. We also note that the criteria must be flexible enough to accommodate domestic sociocultural principles and obligations. And for me, an exact concrete example of those domestic sociocultural principles and obligations in legislation would include in New Zealand, where I come from, Y262. Y262 asserts Māori Indigenous control over Indigenous flora and fauna and the use and transmission of their knowledge. This would also include in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, the founding document, the Treaty of Waitangi, and the Whanganui River Claims Settlement Bill, which confers a legal personality on the Whanganui River here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Additional suggestions include the 4 pillars of the International Labour Organization's Decent Work Agenda and the ILO's resolution on decent work and the social and solidarity economy, as well as the inclusion of fair remuneration or living income and wages. And we've included that particularly with waste pickers in mind, I guess. And also Dr. Fernandez noted too that there is a need for global biomonitoring studies and to set financial or financing mechanisms to support that monitoring. Thanks, Marta.
Thank you so much, Tricia. And with all that, we're going to move towards our next section, which is multi-stakeholder perspectives. And we're going to hear from a bunch of different colleagues and advisors and partners here with us, including Alex Grabowski with WWF, Sean Sutherland with Plastic Planet, Amr Afshar with Shellworks, and Jun Wang, a Culture of Natural Polymer Consortium. And as you can tell, September is going to be very interesting because a lot of you will actually get to see some of these criteria and get to work on, or at least have an opportunity to provide review to this very important and also supposedly simplifying way of looking at a very complex topic. So we're gonna get right back to the LCA debate right now with Alex Grabowski and WWF. We can move to the next slide. Hi, Alex, are you with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I want to take my 5 minutes here to talk about 3 key points with you. I do think that Laurent and Richard's discussion got into some of the points that I want to make earlier, but that's great. I'm going to go ahead and just say them again because I think they're super important. So first, I want to talk about how WWF thinks about alternative materials in the context of our mission to safeguard the future of people and nature. Second, I want to talk about why we need criteria, but also practical tools to compare performance across materials, and also why we need to expand both our toolbox and our thinking beyond traditional life cycle assessment. And third, I want to talk about the importance of integrating this discussion with the broader conservation and sustainability work that's already happening. So yes, you can go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So I wanted to start a little bit with how WWF thinks about this topic in general. So substitution with alternative materials is an important lever to address plastic pollution, but it's far from simple. And the details really matter if we're going to achieve the outcomes that we seek. We want to eliminate plastic pollution, but we also need to do it in a way that supports our goals on climate, on biodiversity, and on just transition. All materials have impact. That means that all materials, alternatives included, need considerations of responsible sourcing, use, and management. And this means that it matters how materials are produced and used on top of making decisions around what alternative materials to use and for what applications. So these aren't simple questions, and that's why it's important that these decisions are informed by universal criteria that allow comparison across the performance of materials, but also this criteria that allow us to actually measure improvement over time, right? So we want to be able to see not just what's the best choice now, but also how can we improve going forward. And while we do need universal criteria, we also need to account for local context. And by local context, I mean the local sourcing and production context, the landscape scale considerations that we need to take in, and considerations of how things are used, disposed, and the opportunities for circularity. No material belongs in nature, whether or not it's biodegradable. And that means that all materials, plastic and alternatives, have to be managed and recirculated. But that doesn't mean that only reuse and recycling are the pathways. Circular systems have both biological and technological pathways. So which one is most appropriate depends on a lot of factors: the application, the material, the available infrastructure, for example. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So there's no perfect solution or silver bullet option. We need to make informed choices about which materials perform best in any given situation. And the reason is because 2 identical pieces of paper would have identical technical performance can have totally different environmental and social impacts, right? If they're sourced from different forests, and those forests are under different management practices. And an equivalent of this kind of scenario is true for all materials. So this is why we need a comprehensive approach to material choices. And while LCA is a great tool on its own, it's not enough. And in fact, our over-reliance on LCA is part of the reason we're in this situation with the plastic pollution crisis to start with. Currently, the impacts of plastic pollution are not commonly modeled in LCA. So when you rely solely on LCA for decision-making of this type, that means you're not considering a very important impact. LCA by design favors efficiency, especially energy efficiency. And so lightweight films tend to come out on top with them. And one of their most important impacts is plastic pollution, and that's not currently included when you use it for the sole basis of decision making. Also, LCAs are based on a functional unit viewpoint, which very much has its advantages, but it also has the drawback of not being a good measure of landscape scale effects. So, for example, if there's a material that's made out of, say, corn from the United States, the LCA is going to tell you that corn has a very high yield and it's land efficient, right? But if you look across the landscape, you can actually see that row crop conversion is a major driver of natural habitat loss, including grasslands in the Northern Great Plains, which is a diverse and important ecosystem in North America. And that's what this slide is talking to you about right here. So this image is from the WWF Plowprint report from 2023, and it's showing the conversion of grasslands over time and the various drivers that are pushing that. Next slide, please. So This isn't to say that we should avoid that as a feedstock because it has an impact. All feedstocks are going to have impacts for any kind of material. Really, it's about safeguards, standards for sourcing practice, and continuous improvement, right? We need to think more broadly and expand our toolkit when making choices about alternative materials, going beyond thinking about efficiency and instead also incorporating considerations of local economies, and how to build in things like climate adaptation and regenerative practices. So we need to work from a headspace of not just choosing materials that have less impact, but of building solutions that actively benefit both people and nature. It certainly isn't easy. It's complicated and there aren't any perfect solutions. But the good news is that there are already a lot of deep bodies of work on these considerations. Which brings me to my last point, which is that I think it's really important that this discussion on plastic alternatives is integrated with existing conservation and sustainability work. This conversation about plastic pollution has really gone fast, and that's amazing. So important to have great momentum, but it also means that it hasn't been as integrated overall as it could be with existing work. And so when it comes to alternative materials, this becomes extremely relevant, right? If you're talking about paper, you need to be talking to the people who are engaged in sustainable forestry practices. If you're talking about metals and glass, you need to be engaging the people who are working on sustainable mining and minerals, right? And if you're talking about bio-based materials, including bio-based plastic, then agriculture becomes a really important topic. So this slide just has a few, existing programs. This is not a complete set, obviously. That would be impossible to put on one slide. But I pulled some out just as examples of all the great work that's already happening. It's going to be so important to connect with. So in conclusion, the criteria and the framework that we come up with here needs to be informed by the existing knowledge that we already have in these fields, and should also be informed by the good practices that they have. And we also need to broaden our viewpoint and toolkit from where it has been in order to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I see the conversation debate is ongoing in the chat, and I'm sure will be ongoing for much longer than that. Then our next speaker today will be Sean Sutherland, a co-founder of Plastic Planet, Plastic Free and Plastic Health Council. Sean, are you here? She's muted, but she's here. All right, perfect.
Unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, great. Let me dive in. I think many of you know that we do a lot of work with the design community, and it shocks me all the time, just the naivety of the people that are actually specifying materials. And I wanted to pull back and really talk about some very simple language and what I've always called the weasel words of plastic and therefore of other materials. And of course, those weasel words are, next slide, are going to be these: recyclable, bio-based, and circular. So we all know that our unpacked certification and all our different recycling symbols are complicated to such an extent there's really scant faith. So we need to challenge ourselves when we're developing these new materials to replace plastic. How can we use this to create a new level of trust and a belief that industry are not simply greenwashing? So if we take each of these words in turn, let's ensure that we are A, telling the truth, and B, obviously not confusing an area that even sitting in on some of these incredibly deep science conversations and the language that we're using today, when you talk to the design community, they will not understand a word of it. So recyclable. Obviously, and I know Richard Thompson has already addressed this, we need to move beyond the theoretical of, well, it could be recycled. It isn't really a problem if the system doesn't exist. We've done the best we can by using a recyclable material. But we know that we're now in a world where the US is currently recycling less than 5%. We know that UK and Europe are not doing much better. 2 billion people have no access to any recycling. So I'd much rather as Richard Thompson suggests, let's think local, and we need to include reality and not theory. So here is just some very simple wording that would make sense to Joe Public to really understand what is recyclable and what isn't. If there's no local system in place that is capable of recycling material into something equally useful, i.e. not downcycling, that material should not be considered recyclable. And I think we have to start using really simple language, or we are just going to get stuck in this mire of confusion. Next slide, please. Bio-based. Now, I don't know if any of you know, but my previous life, I co-founded and ran a skincare brand. We prided ourselves on being as natural as we could be. But of course, that word became meaningless in the personal care world. But the other word that became meaningless was organic. So natural and organic just meant nothing. You can call your product organic with only 2% organic ingredients because there's zero regulation in the personal care industry. So we now live in this world of new materials, and bio-based has the same confusing governance. A bioplastic claiming to be bio-based and healthier for nature can actually comprise of 80% fossil fuel plastic. So we've already made this word bio-based, again, completely worthless. So it leads me on to the next word, circular. Try as we might, we're never going to fit plastic into a circular model. And the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have tried for many, many years to see if we can do that. So we need to ensure that we use this word for a material that is truly going round in a never-ending circle. Otherwise, it's simply a spiral. This illustration, everybody will have seen many times. And of course, the problem with the linear recycling, and here we are now trying to invent this circular economy. The problem with that illustration is there's still a bin. And with the trillions of items that we make every single year, you can imagine how many billions of pieces of waste that we're still going to create with our existing attempts at a circular system. So if we look at the next slide, I think, so why is this always the case? It's because we are trying to take natural resources, we are making stuff with them, and through that process, and leather is a perfect example of that, something that is designed to be the nutrient for the next stage of growth. But what do we do to it? We toxify it, we add heavy metals, we put toxic dyes into it. So when it does go back to nature, as everything does, including ourselves, it goes back as a toxin. So we need to start thinking about circularity and educate people on a different kind of circularity, because there's only one circle that matters, and it's called nature. It's not the circular economy, it's called working with nature, regenerating nature, because otherwise there will be no economy at all. So if you look at the way that nature works, there is no waste. Of course, we know that. You take nutrients from nature, you bake them, you mold them, you shape them, you make something useful out of them. But fundamentally, you do not lose their nutrient status. So when they go back to nature, they go back as a nutrient. Next slide. Because nature is black and white. It is binary. There is no gray area for nature. You are either giving nature back something that is, next slide, a toxin, a poison, or you're giving nature back something that it can use for the next stage of growth. And this is truly working with nature. Final slide. Because this gray area, this whole quagmire of less bad materials that I am confounded by every single day, building plastic free, working with the Plastic Health Council, working with the creative community and industry, there is this big gray area that we need to be very, very careful of. And words are unbelievably powerful, as we know, and many people have addressed these already, of just the terminology has to be so careful, but it also has to be so simple. And my final slide is because if we don't regenerate nature, and regenerative materials have to regenerate nature, then, as we all know, it is game over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. Our next speaker coming up, we'll learn a little bit more about some of it in practice, I guess, in business, in practice at scale. We have here with us co-founder of Shellworks, Amir Afshar. Hi, Amir. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi. Great. Thanks very much. Lovely to see familiar faces, and thanks for all the presentations. And Sean, always a difficult person to follow. You have great presentations always. So we're from Shellworks. We're a material science and application focused company that is basically trying to eliminate plastic pollution. Could just go to the next slide, please. So what we do is we collaborate with nature to make home compostable packaging that performs like plastic but never becomes waste. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that and what we mean by that. So go to the next slide, please. So what we do is we created a material called Vivama. We've done this in collaboration with nature. So it's a microbially derived material that we use to create plastic-like products. And we have a number of different variations of material properties that we formulate in-house. I'm going to talk a little bit about the decision-making processes that we go through, but I'll just show you a couple of things if we move to the next slide that we've created. We've been focused on making packaging for the personal care and cosmetic spaces as an initial market, primarily because there aren't solutions that can be robust and provide them with the properties that they need. And this is often why they end up turning back to plastic. So Vivama has great properties in that, if you could move to the next slide, it can be resistant to both oil and water-based formulations. It can last as long as it needs to, really. So you can have it in your bathroom. It's not broken down by water. It really needs to end up in a non-sterile environment. For example, home compost, to start that degradation process. If you go to the next slide, please. So we've created things that I showed you, like rigid things, but we've also created things like bottles. This is a new development that we have made, and we use different microorganisms and create formulations that is able to perform in different application spaces. Again, with exactly the same origin and exactly the same end-of-life properties. Go to the next slide. And this is happening at scale. So these are bottles that we now ship to Wild, which is a company in the UK that was known for making the first refillable deodorant. Now they've moved into refillable body wash. These are in major retailers in the UK and in Europe. By the end of the year, we would have shipped over 800,000 of these to them. So this is not something which is just a small scale project. This is something that can have scale. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the decision making that we do to sort of decide how we build these materials. So next slide, please. So the first step for us is an internal screening and evaluation. And every formulation decision that we do starts with asking ourselves a number of questions. The first questions we ask is effectively to understand what is the origin of the material. So if you go to the next slide, please. Where does it come from and what does it come from? And this is really looking at that origin. What is the feedstock? What are the implications of using that feedstock? Is it something that's ethically sourced? Is it something that could be harmful? Is it something that could be harmful in use? Is it stable and is it suitable for this application? When we talk about suitability for application, we're trying to understand, should we be making this out of an alternative material? Should it be made of something else? And really understanding, is this the right fit? Within the personal care and cosmetic space, for example, a lot of things are made of plastic, but they're just simply too small or too complex to be effectively recycled. And then the most important thing, as I touched on, is what happens once it's disposed of and what happens if it gets fugitive. So, I've heard a lot of people speak today about methods of disposal, but also what happens if it doesn't end up in those places that we want it to sort of end up in. The next thing that we do is do external third-party validation. So we actually use TÜV Austria's home compost certification, not because we believe that everyone should have access to home compost, but because of what it's comprised of in terms of its composition. So the first thing they ask us is characterization. So they ask us every single ingredient that is in that material, and we have to tell them what it is because they want to evaluate, are there heavy metals? Are there things in it that they deem problematic? The second is they undertake a biodegradation test, which is really evaluating, can this be broken down naturally? Can this be broken down by microorganisms that exist in nature? The next thing they do is a disintegration test. They say, look, how long will it actually take to break down? And then the final thing that they do in that test is ecotoxicity. So effectively, they're asking a question, okay, when it breaks down, what will it break down into, and is it safe? So as you can see, these tests that they run sort of mimic the internal decision-making that we had previously made. And then we follow that up with independent tests with labs where we're looking at what happens in landfill, what happens in marine environment, what happens in soil. And then we do real world field testing as well, which we do both ourselves, but also with a community of scientists and around the country that we can actually gather data from. So if we move to the next slide, some of the areas that we've struggled with and we see as areas of future improvements is that we see that there's a lot of updates needed to, for example, the way that things are certified. A lot of these certifications that exist externally are built on without thinking about current material innovations. An example, again, if I go back to home compost certification, a piece of paper would get certified as home compostable, but a branch or a small wood chip may not get certified, and that's because of the timelines and the thicknesses that that test is set up for. And again, updating legislation would be very useful because legislation is very behind as compared to some of the advancements and innovations that there are. At the time, they thought there were no alternatives. So if we talk about threats and implicit biases, I think this area is something that we struggle with quite a lot. So if we head to the next slide, please. So as compared to incumbent plastics, and I'm talking here about when we speak to brands, we suffer much greater scrutiny and skepticism. So our burden of proof is really, really high. We have to provide them with a lot of documentation. And then even once we've got that documentation, there is a fear from brands that they would be greenwashing. So we've given them a ton of documentation. And the example I give here is I challenged an enterprise brand on this because on their website, on their disposal instructions, they say the material is recyclable, but we recommend that you call your local municipality to see if it will be recycled. Effectively, this is passing the blame across and saying it's not our fault if it doesn't get dealt with. I challenged them on this, and they said, "Oh, everyone does that, and that's why it's okay to do it," which is clearly, an unacceptable approach. There's also unequal expectations of data and certification. So often our customers, if they decide to go with PCR, they say, "Oh, because the targets were 30% PCR, I've got no more questions." And so they end up reverting back to plastic simply because it's a very easy tick box exercise for them. The final thing is, LCAs are skewed in the way that they are evaluated. So I know we've spoken a little bit about that today, and Laurent gave a good review. If we just move to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about that. The impact categories that are looked at by customers, by brands, are really looking at things like carbon footprint. They're not looking at that end-to-end process. Where did the material come from? Where did it end up? And actually, as a provider of alternative materials, we are often asked to do the LCA for plastics and then make a comparison. So again, that goes back to that burden of proof being very high when actually we're being asked to do quite a lot more than is asked of existing plastic manufacturers. The final thing that I will show you is I've tried to remove as much branding as possible here, but I think this is an interesting example of how this is manifesting. So this is from a retailer within the UK, and it's how they evaluate materials. And they're evaluating materials purely on the basis of, can it be easily recycled? And what that results in is that things like compostable materials, biodegradable materials are put in the same category as really, really toxic things like PVC. And then if you look in the green category, you end up having things like monomaterial spouted pouches claiming to be quite, easily recyclable, when in reality they're not. And if we go to the next slide, I wanted to just call out one of the points which shows this sort of bias. In the amber category, they talk about complex laminates, and then they define at the bottom in a sort of a sentence which seems kind of ridiculous. They say that rigid and flexible complex laminates can only be used should only include a mixture of materials where required barrier properties mean no monomaterial alternatives are available. So what they're saying here effectively is you can use complex laminates, but if you provide us with a material which is an alternative, which is clearly better and has better criteria, we're still going to reject it. So I think there is a little bit of an imbalance here in terms of how people are evaluating materials. And if you go to the next slide, please. Really, I think, as we've heard today, if we can move away from defining materials and choosing materials based on what they are, to sort of looking at compositions, criteria, as we've heard today, characteristics, and what happens at end of life, we can make sure that we're always comparing the same criteria. Otherwise, we end up in a situation where we're not comparing apples to apples, and we end up, classing things in a way which is not really deemed helpful.
Thank you so much, Amber. And we have some questions waiting for you already in the chat. And please stay tuned for a Q&A session at the end. If you do have questions, it'll be great if we can address them at the end. But with that in mind, we'll move to our last speaker of today, is Dr. Jun Wang, who will be covering natural polymers and material opportunity. And I know Dr. Jun Wang is representing Colgate as far as a consortium, and he'll tell you more about that. Hi,
Okay,
Jun.
thanks. Yeah, thanks. So first of all, really thanks OPL and invited me to give this talk. And I also heard all these previous speakers give fantastic talk. I'd like to thank them. It's kind of, they are setting up a foundation for me to introduce this initiatives, Natural Polymer Consortium. Also, I put the link there. So if you're interested, you can go there to take a look. So this Natural Polymer Consortium is what industry is thinking about what's the best solution to curb the plastic pollution issue. And we know that industry is working on recycling bio-based biodegradable to try to find the plastic alternatives. And we also realized that a lot of previous speakers mentioned. So every so-called potential solution, they have their own limitations. Definitely, they will not bring the complete solution to curb the plastic pollution. So we're thinking, next slide, please. So we're thinking maybe there is some other solution which is underexplored and which actually is look at the nature. So there are a lot of things we can learn from nature. And actually, there's some concept that nature is using that we are not implementing. We're not even thinking about that maybe. So for example, there's a tree growing, you know, that circle, there's a fantastic closed loop, and grow, leaf, fall, disappear, and grow again. So keep learning. This is carbon loop. So you will notice there's no reuse, no recycling in nature. So mechanical recycling part. And there's no collection. You don't need to collect those waste because nature turned that so-called waste valuable. They are the food for the animals, for microorganisms. So this will be consumed. So it will not be the waste. Is a valuable stuff, feedstock for something. And also, even though we see that the leaves can disappear, but there's a tricky that our current plastics does not have that kind of capability. It's a triggered biodegradation. So a lot of plastic, a lot of leaves, when they grow on the trees, they do not degrade. Only if they fall onto the ground, the biodegradation starts. Plastic does not have that capability, no matter what we call them biodegradable or not. So they are not like have this kind of naturally have properties that the nature products have. And also nature products are in general not toxic. So because it goes through the millions of years of nature selection. Next slide, please. So that's why we think, how we can really find some alternative to the plastics. You have to admit plastics is a very fantastic human innovations. You can just think 100 years ago, a human cannot imagine they can from some liquid called the crude oil, they can turn that into every applications we're using today. So this is an enormous innovation. We have to admit that. And also there are a lot of good benefits and that the plastics has. So that makes our at this moment try to find the alternative so difficult. And if you compare to other people said to solve this plastic pollution, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Here is a one-size-fits-all materials we ever created, human ever created. That's plastics. Plastics has already almost replaced all other material, which makes it to replace this even more complicated, more difficult. But fortunately, if you look at the natural polymers, potentially it has all the it can meet all the performance benefit that the plastics have. Either performance, processability, cost, etc. So it's okay. Next slide. So we're happy to see actually industry has already made. Amir mentioned his product fantastic, and also there's some big companies. They mass produce natural polymers. One is from the Curie. This is their product called Plantic. it's a starch-based product. It can be processed like plastics, meaning when you put it in injection molding, you can form the parts. And the good thing is that this thing is coming from nature. It will disappear, not necessarily disappear. It will be consumed if you after the products have been used and disposed, microorganisms can digest them. And another example is from CJ Bio. This is a PHA, mass-produced PHA. So PHA is a bacterial grow material and is coming from nature and it can be consumed from nature, and it also can be processed as plastics. Next slide, please. So that's why we think, how we can really promote another route. So crude oil is nothing special. It's just a million years of natural polymers. It's just gone through the millions of years of conversion to the crude oil. So right in the last century, human turned them into all kinds of application, like a short-lived application and a durable application. So what we like to propose here is we're not talking about replace all the plastics, but can we try to use humans' capability for the innovation and put the accumulated the knowledge on the polymers and invest money. And so with some luck, probably we can come from the nature polymer directly, turn them into the product to replace the single-use or short-lived plastic applications. Next, please. So that's definitely we need to crack in the code of the nature. So nature, actually, there's a lot of mysterious code that we just haven't cracked yet. But as I mentioned earlier, we have already cracked the code of the crude oil to plastics. So with another century of innovation, we're pretty sure that we can find some ways to crack the nature. Because if you look at over here, nature is very fantastic, but nature is made of some simple components, and it's if we can really find the way to mimic the nature or to crack their code, we might find a solution and to make full use of them. Next slide, please. So that's exactly the purpose we want to found this natural polymer consortium. This is a consortium we want to collaborate with the industry, academia, and NGO. We want to work together and to find the real material solution for 21st century. We have to admit 20th century, the material is plastic, but the 21st century, we might have some new material. We hope it will be natural polymers. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Jun. And if you do have any questions for Jun Wang, this is the time to ask. As we're running towards the end of our time today, I just want to say thank you all for your contributions. And I really want to highlight that as OPLN, we are a neutral secretariat and we are very much bringing forward all the diverse perspective on this topic. And it really is required that all of you are here and participating and engaging in this process as these criteria are being developed. And we're hoping that you will be engaged even deeper than today in providing us with critical feedback as we develop those criteria towards INC-5 in Busan. We have very limited time. It is a sprint. We're working feverishly on incorporating all of this feedback and all of the perspective, all the debates that are taking place into one singular document. And it is a very large task, and it could not be happening without our independent science panel and all the advisors engaged. So thank you so much for being here today and joining us, and stay tuned for more updates in the upcoming week and the following week, as we'll be getting to the meat of it all and actual, working on the revisions of the paper. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.